Hi, I'm Sleep Aid, your local sleep paralysis demon, and today we're taking a look at a comic called I Wish by Sun and Moon Comics. Now, it's been a long time since I reviewed anything. I was most active during the Webtoon Legends contest last year, but I've been getting back into Webtoons and reviewing them lately, and so that's something that I wanted to start doing again. If you would like to have your comic reviewed, I've got a post over on the Webtoon Canvas subreddit where you may submit your comic, and if there's any specific elements of it you would like me to take a look at and analyze, I will be happy to do that for you. And so, hopefully we will have a lot of these coming out in the near future. Definitely let me know if you would like to see more of them in the YouTube comments. But today we're going to be starting with I Wish by Sun and Moon Comics. It is a supernatural action comic. I'll go ahead and read the description, and then we'll start discussing the comic itself. So it says, in a moment of extreme emotions, 8 teens make a wish, unaware of the curse that's loomed over their town since its founding. Using the powers the curse grants them, will they be able to keep the monsters back long enough to break the curse? Now then, let's go ahead and jump into the first episode and begin our discussion. So, the author of this comic specifically highlighted dialogue and pacing as areas that they were concerned about, and so I'll try to talk a lot about those, but initially we start off, we've got this panel introducing our 8 main characters. This is all 8 of them in a row, and then we see what each of their wishes are in these dialogue balloons, but this kind of immediately shows us something of an issue that we have right away, which is we don't necessarily know who is making which wish, and so it's kind of hard to tell who's talking. Now, this is something that does get addressed later, but along with further complications, and so immediately with this story we are thrown into the lives of these high school students, and they're presented with a mysterious fog that teleports them to another world where they are attacked by monsters. And the thing that I noticed right away is that the panel layouts of this comic are done much more like a traditional comic would be, which is fine in a traditional comic hosting website, but on Webtoon, you really want to make sure that all the panels are stacked vertically, because the primary design philosophy of Webtoon as a platform is that it's made to be user-friendly for mobile devices. And so what that means is essentially the expectation is that people are going to read these comics on a cell phone. And so what you need to do when you make a comic on Webtoon is let's see here. So, highlighted section, that's one panel. So that is about the length of a phone screen. And so all of this information is going to be on a cell phone at the same time. And so if you have a lot of these smaller dialogue bubbles or too many panels at one time, then it becomes hard to actually see it and hard to tell what's going on. And so what you really want to do with Webtoon formatting is try to make the panels big and try to make it so that there aren't too many happening simultaneously. And you also really want to avoid having panels stacked next to each other, because the entire design of the platform is vertical scroll. The expectation that you're going to scroll down to read an episode, and so you don't want to be constantly looking left and right. You want to be going from top to bottom. And so when you have, like this, for example, 2 small panels right next to each other, this is harder to read on a cell phone. And so immediately, that's what comes to mind with this, is that a lot of the panels are made in a traditional layout, whereas if you're posting a comic on Webtoon, you should really try to adapt it for the Webtoon style of vertical scroll. You should try to take these panels, split them apart, zoom in, and put them on top of each other rather than right next to each other. And another thing that's important to note with vertical scroll is that it actually does give you a lot of control over the pacing of a scene. And so it's important to remember that you can utilize blank space in a vertical scroll comic to create slower pacing, to slow down the pacing and give each panel more time to breathe so that the reader has longer time to dwell on each panel. And it can help you kind of deliberately control the pacing. So The reason I bring that up is because this first episode of this comic, we have so many panels that are so close together that it makes it feel like the pace is happening really, really quickly. But that can be confusing when we jump between scenes. For example, here we've got the characters going into the fog, and now our next panel is directly underneath the previous one. And so in Webtoon format, that makes it feel like the scene hasn't changed. But since we're now dealing with a different character in a different place, we know that the scene has changed. But this makes it confusing to read. And so it's really important to utilize your space, your empty space, your dead space on your episodes to kind of set the pacing. And usually when you want to switch scenes like this, it's good to start with an establishing shot and also a lot of space in between the panels to show that the scene has changed so that the reader has time to process that we are moving to a different location. Whereas when we have, again, so many panels stacked so close together, it can feel like things are moving very quickly, and it's easy to get lost very, very easily. And so what seems to be happening in this comic is, as I said, we have our 8 characters who are living ordinary lives, and they are transported by a magical fog to another dimension where they are attacked by shadow monsters, and they fight for their lives against these shadow monsters until eventually they are sent back to their own world. And on the topic of dialogue, in our first few episodes, we have fairly standard dialogue balloons, but there is something that I would like to point out about these, which is that I think that the dialogue itself is actually fine. The words that the characters are saying are fine. The characters all seem to have personalities, and the things that they're saying all make sense. It feels believable the way that they talk to each other. The trouble that this comic has with dialogue is just that the balloons are a little bit awkwardly done, and so something that's important to note with dialogue balloons is you want to make sure that the text has enough space in the balloon so that it doesn't feel too crowded. So in this page, as an example, you can see that the outline of the balloon comes right up against the text, which can make it feel very, very claustrophobic inside the balloon. You want to give a little bit more dead space in the balloon around the text, because it helps to separate the dialogue from the panel itself. It makes it a little bit easier to read that way. And another thing I wanted to point out is most prominent in the first episode here. Let's actually go back. The use of thought balloons. So what a lot of webtoons do these days is actually use a different outline around thought balloons versus speech balloons. So they'll use a normal standard solid outline for speech balloons, but for the thought balloons, they'll have kind of like a really messy, rough, like spiky outline to show that it's a different type of dialogue. And so you can look at it immediately and see that, okay, this is thinking versus speaking. Whereas in this comic, we've just got the traditional bubbles leading to the character. But when you're reading so many of these balloons in a row, and you see another one that is the same outline as a standard text balloon, it makes it feel like it's also spoken dialogue. And so again, it just creates visual confusion that makes it a little bit harder to follow cohesively. It breaks up the scene more, and it kind of takes the reader out of it a little bit. And so I think that the actual dialogue is fine from a writing perspective. I just think the real trouble with dialogue here is just the way the balloons are handled. I would definitely recommend studying up on ways to handle dialogue balloons and thought balloons better. There are almost too many things to cover regarding those in just this review video. It would have to turn into a whole separate video. So as for the story itself, the idea is actually fairly interesting, and the characters all feel very expressive. And so let's go ahead and put a like on this episode as we go through. The characters are very expressive. But one of the problems that I have, and this pertains to the pacing, is that we don't really get a good introduction to the characters. And so it makes it, again, a little bit hard to follow, because we don't really know who any of these people are by the time they're thrust into this adventure that they're going on. And so we get a very, very small window into their lives before each of them are dragged through the fog into another dimension. And so we see some of the characters are skaters, We see some of them are jocks, and we see some of them are hanging out in an arcade, but we don't even get all of the names of the characters initially, and so when you're introducing so many characters at one time, when we don't really have names or we don't know much about them, it makes it hard to follow. We don't necessarily have an investment in these characters yet because there are too many of them being introduced at one time, and we don't really have the time to dwell on them and get to know them and associate their names with their faces. And so that's something that I think, again, is really a place where maybe the pacing could afford to be slowed down a little bit, is in giving the reader time to really get to know each character, so that way, when they're thrown into this situation, we have an idea of who we're dealing with. Or at the very least, we could spend more time kind of fleshing them out during the situation and kind of showing what each of their strengths and weaknesses are. And I think that it does that a little bit as it goes along, but it takes kind of several episodes to get to that point. And so there are many episodes in the beginning where it's just kind of confusing. So I guess to summarize on pacing, I think that what this comic would probably benefit from pacing-wise is maybe having more time in between the fighting sessions to really establish the characters. So after the third episode, we jump back to the real world. Our characters all return home, and then they start to deliberate about what happened in the other dimension where they were, accosted by monsters. And at this point, in order to kind of make it more obvious who's speaking, we switch to color dialogue inside the balloons. And so when we have so many characters on screen, having a color code like this can be helpful, but the trouble is some of the colors are actually really hard to read. And so when you have light colors on a light background, it can make it really, really hard to read. There were some of these panels, especially with the font that it's in, where I had to really zoom in a lot and concentrate because one character talks in yellow. Yeah, here's an example. So bold yellow text on a white background is extremely hard to read. So I think it's definitely better to just stick to plain black and white text. But if you're going to do colored text in order to denote who's talking, make sure that it is colors that have high contrast, colors that are darker and that stand out better against a white balloon, because there are a lot of these, like there's sometimes where the pink feels a little too light, it's harder to read, but the yellow especially can be very hard to read. And on the topic of color, another suggestion that I would have is adjusting the color palette between the background and the characters. So something that is important in a comic like this, which has very vivid colors, is to make sure that the characters really can stand out from the background. But you'll see on some panels like this where we have the background, the colors on the background are as vivid as the colors on the characters. And so when you have so many vivid colors on a panel, it can blur together a little bit. And so ways to get around that are to either, put a filter over the background or maybe blur the background slightly to give it a DSLR effect, or just use like slightly more muted colors on the background so that the characters pop out from it, or maybe heavier outlines, or any number of tricks really, but just making sure that the characters aren't blurring into the background so much. Whereas, again, all of these things combined, like everything I've pointed out so far are like largely small issues. It's just that when they all are operating in tandem, it kind of creates this scenario where the comic can be very hard to read, because you have characters kind of blurring in with the background, you have some text balloons that are really hard to read compared to others, and then you've got thought bubbles that are hard to distinguish from speech bubbles, and then you've also got all the panels right up against each other with very little spacing in between them. And so the result is a comic that at times is just hard to read. And since it's done in traditional page format, as in this case, for example, sometimes it's not easy to tell what order you're supposed to read the panels in. So normally you go from left to right and then top to bottom. So you would go here and then there and then there. And then there are some scenarios like this where it's not clear if I'm supposed to read the right panel next or the one below and then the right panel. And again, with Webtoon, you really want to take advantage of that vertical scroll format and separate these panels and space them out more. And the benefit of that as well is that it can make an episode actually feel longer. And so even if it's the same amount of panels, if they're stacked on top of each other instead of all crammed together like this, it'll feel like it's a lot longer. And so anyway, we take a little while for all of our characters to discuss the events that they've gone through. They start trying to make plans for how they're going to deal with it when next they face it. And then we have a few begin to collect weapons, anticipating that they are going to be fighting again. And this helps us get a little bit of a better understanding of some of our characters, but I feel like this is a point where we could probably take a little bit more time to make sure that every character gets a scene so that we can really start to latch onto them, because that's probably my biggest point of criticism for this story, is that it's a comic that has a very large cast of characters, and it's also a very fast-paced comic. And being fast-paced, I think, is actually usually a good thing on Webtoon. Especially with an action series, I think it's a good idea to get right to the point, get right into the action, and start the story moving right away. And this comic does that. It moves very, very quickly. But it's important to remember that if you have such a large cast of characters, if you have 8 characters as your main cast, you need to make sure that in these action scenarios that the reader has the opportunity to get invested in these characters. We want to feel like we know who they are and how they interact with each other and what their dynamics are. And so we want to take a little bit of time to kind of breathe and get acquainted with our characters. And when you have a very fast-paced story, if there is only one character, if there's only a few characters, then you can introduce the character as you go. It's very easy to use all that screen time to set up your character even in the middle of an action scene. But when you have 8 characters and they're all participating in different action scenes simultaneously, it ends up taking longer to get to know them. And so that's the thing that really stood out the most to me, was that it was kind of hard to tell who everybody was, and there were times where I couldn't remember who was doing what. And again, I found that after I'd read a lot of this, I couldn't really recall most of the characters' names. And I wasn't really sure who was good at what. And there's a lot of jumping back and forth and jumping around. And so I think that it definitely suffers a little bit from having such a large cast and a fast pace. Whereas, in order to do both, you kind of need to introduce the characters a little bit more slowly than this. So since we're introducing 8 characters all at the same time, and we're having a really, really fast pace, it feels like we don't have enough time to get to know those characters. Whereas, if you wanted to do a larger cast and a fast pace, it would be better if you introduce them one by one. That way, we have more time to dwell on each character and kind of get to know them. But I think that the idea itself is fun. I will say that after 13 episodes of this, it feels like we don't really know what the comic is about yet. We don't really know where it's going, and we're not really sure what the general premise is. So, as I said, we have our 8 characters. They all get teleported to this mysterious world where they are attacked by shadow monsters, and they struggle to fight back, and so far, that is all that has happened. And I think it's kind of important when you have a vague concept like this to kind of introduce the stakes and the rules right away. So there's one character, for example, that is defeated in one of these episodes and melts into a puddle, and as readers, we don't yet know if that is permanent, if that character is dead, or if that's just a temporary setback. Is it video game rules? We don't really know what the stakes are. And so we've got 8 characters that we don't know very well, fighting in a scenario with stakes that we don't know very well. And I think that slowing down the pacing and building up those elements would be a huge benefit to this, especially when we consider the upload schedule, which, let's see, did I get all of them? I think I did. Oh, I missed episode 3. Hold on, I'll give that a like. And there we go. And so as I was saying, so the first episode, October 31st of 2023, and the most recent episode, October 17th of 2025. And so this is over the course of 2 years. We've only got 13 episodes, but the plot hasn't really advanced much. We've spent a lot of time on these action scenes, which are fun to read. The action scenes are interesting and they are entertaining, but it feels like we don't have a lot of investment in the overall plot, and we don't have a lot of investment in the individual characters. And so I think that probably what this series really needs to do is take the time to kind of make us care about the characters a little bit more. And if it's going to continue, what I would probably suggest is using the downtime in between fights to really build up the characters. And so so far in the comic, there's the opening sequence of all the characters getting teleported in, and then there's the initial fight scene, which is pretty short, and then there is the scene where they're all back in the real world for a couple of episodes, and they plan for what they're going to do the next time they go into the other world so that they can plan to fight against the monsters. And then the fight takes place over the course of what looks like 7 episodes, and it's still not over yet. And so essentially we've spent all of our time either fighting or planning to fight, but we haven't spent enough time with the characters and building up their personalities. And so probably that would be my suggestion, is after the fight scene is over here, to kind of peel back a little bit and give us some insight into what each of these characters' struggles are, and kind of why they're involved in this thing, and what it is that they're actually battling against, and why we should be cheering for them. Overall, though, I would say it is a very interesting series, and again, I think its strengths are also its weaknesses as well. I think that having a very fast pace for an action series like this is a good thing. Yeah, I prefer that in an action series, the action starts very quickly, and it does in this one. It starts right off the bat. 3 episodes, we're already fighting. And so that's very good. But I also feel that we move a little too quickly sometimes, and we need to explain what the rules are to the reader. Because if we know what the rules are, what the stakes are, and why these characters are in this situation, that will help us get invested in it more, and it will make us want to cheer for them and follow them on their journey. And so those are the places where I think it kind of falls short a little bit, is building that investment in the characters. And I think it presents a few too many characters at one time. I would, though, like to see where it goes. I think, again, it presents an intriguing situation, and it does pique my curiosity, and it makes me wonder what's going to happen next. And I think that, although I don't feel like I really know most of the characters very well, the ones that got a lot of screen time I did feel were fun to follow, and I like the way that some of the characters interact with each other, and I think that there is certainly a lot of good stuff here. We've just got to make it more obvious, I guess. Take the good elements and amplify them a little bit, and don't be afraid to dwell on the characters more, because while the action is fun, the best action scenes are ones where the reader has investment in the outcome of the scene, where we care about the people that are involved, and we really want to see them win. And so it's important to build that. I think I'm kind of rambling in circles at this point. I feel like I made every point that I wanted to make here. Yeah. Sorry if I talked on a little bit long. I didn't think it would go on for this long, but I'll go ahead and leave it at that. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one. I will see you in your nightmares.